Chapter 10 of Blackerchief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Payton of Omaha, Nebraska. chowdownright.blogspot.com. Blackerchief Dick by Margery Allingham, Chapter 10. After his conversation with Blackerchief Dick, Blueneck found leisure to attend to his own amours. He first retired to the brig, where, with the help of Habakkuk Coot, he arrayed himself in his best clothes, tied the knee-latchets of his breeches with bright-colored tapes, and borrowed a brilliant red-and-green kerchief from out poor Matt Turnby's bundle, and then, after carefully tying the length of cherry ribbon, which had cost him much time and trouble to procure, in a piece of muslin, he stowed the packet in one of his big side pockets and started out for Joe Pullen's house. He had some little way to go, as the Pullens' cottage was situated slightly to the north of the church, and that was about 1.5 miles from the point where the brig was moored. He walked along cheerfully, whistling a chanty, and mentally rehearsing the speech which he intended to make to Mistress Amy when presenting the ribbon. In spite of the time of year, the late afternoon sun shone brightly on the wet grass, and there was a touch of spring in the air. On nearing the cottage, he stopped to see if he still had the little muslin packet, and, feeling it still there, strode nonchalantly up to the door and knocked loudly. Mistress Pullen opened it herself, and seeing him, put her finger to her lips. Blueneck stood still looking at her, very disappointed and a little foolish. Inside the cottage he could hear deep, rafter-shaking snores, and soon understood that the lady's husband was within. He opened his mouth to speak, but Amy shook her head violently, and he shut it again with a snap. However, he did not move, and Mistress Pullen had to push him off the doorstep and whisper, "This evening," before he fully realized that he was not wanted. Fumbling in his pocket, he hastily found the ribbon, and snatching it out, crammed it into her hand, then tiptoed off down the path, feeling that he had been cheated. Amy took the parcel without looking up and quickly slipped back, shutting the door carefully behind her. Blueneck returned along the way he had come, in a much less cheerful frame of mind than when he started out. He no longer whistled, but lurched along, his head bent and his hands thrust deep in his pockets. On passing the ship, sounds of cheerfulness came out to him through the open door, and, yielding to the impulse of the moment, he went in. As usual, the scene in the ship kitchen was cheering even to look at. The roaring fire in the open grate, the glinting lights on the pewter, and the shadowy, dusky corners in which faint outlines of casks and strings of drying onions could just be distinguished, all gave it a cozy, comforting appearance. At least Blueneck thought so, as he joined the circle round the fire and called for hot rum to be served to him. Old Gilbert was in a lively mood. He sat in his corner, his blue eyes twinkling from out huge creases of fat, singing, laughing, and drinking with the best will in the world, and keeping the company in a continual roar of laughter. Big French sat on the other side of the fireplace, playing with little Red Farron and his kitten. The little boy was a favorite of the big man, and they chatted together with an equal share of enjoyment. Sue leaned over the back of the seat and from time to time joined in their conversation. At these times French smiled contentedly, and almost as easily as he did on the days before the little dark-eyed, white-handed Spaniard landed east instead of west of Mercy Marsh Island. Annie and Hal were talking together in the background as they polished up the tankards. She was telling him about the Spaniard's desire to rename the brig, and clearing away with her gentle cajolery all his little jealous fears and doubts. Several other men were sitting round the fire. They were Habakkuk Coote, sniffing as usual and drinking spiced ale, old Master Granger, guffawing at Gilbert and sipping his neat rum with obvious relish, Kip de Musset, chewing a chunk of coarse black tobacco, a habit much disapproved of by the islanders, who thought the weed a dangerous new-fangled drug, and of no use save to sell to other people, and one or two others. All very merry and cheerful, and good company to each other. Blue Neck drank his rum, and beginning to feel more cheerful, he leaned forward a little to join in the talk. "Ah, a wonderful funny thing that be," Granger was saying, as he shook his head sagely. "You're right, a wonderful funny thing." "Ah, and what's more, it ain't the first time it's happened," put in another man casually. "What?" In an instant the company's attention was fixed on the new speaker, and he looked round as though he were going to say something very secret. "6 months ago on Ray Island," he said. "Ah, everyone knows that, Tom Fish. Go home with your old stories." There was a note of disappointment in their voices, and they all laughed. The man muttered something about their being old, and subsided. Blue Neck came a little nearer. "Might I ask what you are talking about?" he said. Kip de Musset rolled his quid into his cheek and spat before he replied. "A rowboat load of rum and 2 men lost going from here to Bradwell," he said laconically. "Ah," said Granger, "wonderful strange." "What, ain't the boat been washed up?" said Blue Neck, glad to enter into the conversation. "No, nothing found at all," said Granger eagerly, as he shifted his position slightly. "Nothing at all. But, well," he added, "I don't know what's come to them." "Would the preventative men have catched them, think you?" remarked Kip, chewing. "Now that are likely," said Granger sarcastically, "ain't it? There not being a sign of a preventative man these 9 months, oh, yes, Master de Musset, it are likely they'd be spry enough to catch 2 chaps in a rowboat in the middle of the Blackwater without a soul on the island or the mainland knowing aught. Lord, you ought to have been an excise man yourself, you ought." "Maybe, Granger, maybe," said Kip de Musset placidly, and without ceasing to chew. "Maybe they drank the liquor, and then pulled out the bung, and sunk her theirselves," suggested Habakkuk, sniffing violently. Granger turned slowly in his seat and let his gaze fall upon the nervous little man for a second or two before he spoke. "Ah, Master Reuben the Head, maybe they did," he said, "and maybe the devil come along and carried them off in a thundercloud. Or maybe a sea serpent swallowed them, eh?" Habakkuk looked into the others' unsmiling faces and sniffed, while a weak, ineffectual little smile spread over his bilious, pimply face, and then, as Granger betrayed no amusement, it struck him that he must have said something sensible, so he answered, "Aye, most likely," wagging his head sagely. The company burst into a roar of laughter, and Habakkuk, feeling that this time he had been witty, joined with them happily. "Ah, no, but it is unnatural," continued Granger thoughtfully, after the laughter had subsided. "And you know it ain't the first time a rowboat of rum and two chaps have been lost," he went on. "Just in the same way, too. Started off after dawn and never seen no more. Ah, unnatural. That's what it is." "The currents be plaguey strong out in the channel," said French, looking up for a moment. Granger was up in arms at once. "Currents!" he ejaculated. "Now just tell me, Master French, do you think either Clara Kidley or Gustav Norton would be likely to run into anything like that? And if they did, to stay in it? Just tell me." French shrugged his shoulders and continued to explain to Red the kitten's natural objection to being stroked from tail to the ears. Granger looked round triumphantly. I don't know, he said at last. "More do we," said Habakkuk, with a sniff, and the talk drifted to other channels. Blueneck was feeling that perhaps the world was not so dreary a place as he had imagined, when the door burst open and young Tant Pullen rushed in without a hat and very breathless. He looked round the room for a moment as though searching for someone. At last his quick bright eyes fell upon Blueneck, and he darted over to him. "Look out, you! Get out of here, and hide quick!" he gasped as well as he could for lack of breath. The Spanish sailor looked at him in surprise, and the rest of the company, seeing that something was afoot, turned to listen. Tant took the sailor by the collar when he saw that the man did not move. "Quick, hurry, or he'll get you," he said. Blueneck opened his mouth in astonishment. "Why, what?" he ejaculated. Tant took a deep breath. "My mother's been beating my father because he said that she took presents from strangers," he volunteered. The company began to laugh, and Blueneck still looked bewildered. Tant gave one anxious look at the door. "Mother says I was to come and tell you," he said. Again the circle rocked, and the mystified Blueneck looked up. "Well?" he said. Tant sighed. "You best come," he said. "My father's wonderfully riled after he's been beat by my mother, and he's coming up here to beat you now." "Oh!" The company went off into another paroxysm of laughter, and Blueneck began to see a little more light in the matter. "Let him come," he said, shrugging his shoulders. Hal stepped forward from the dresser where he had been arranging tankards. "You better go, Master Blueneck," he said. "Joe's wonderfully strong, and after he's been beat by his wife, there's no holding him." Blueneck hesitated. Then he shrugged his shoulders. Whatever he was, Dick Delfazio's mate was no coward, and he stood his ground. "I am not feared," he said. "Let him come." Hal looked at Gilbert, who had been watching the scene attentively.
She's all right,"
said the old man.
"Let him come, Hal."
Hal shrugged his shoulders, and sent Annie upstairs to look to the guest's room. Then he quietly and unobtrusively moved everything movable to the sides of the room, so leaving a clear space in the center. The company also shrugged their shoulders and edged a little away from Blueneck, so that the sailor found himself sitting alone on a bench. He looked round him uneasily, but did not move. Suddenly Tant, who had been looking out of the window, remarked in a stage whisper, "Here he come," and then dived under a pile of sacking in a far corner. Nobody spoke, and the silence was almost uncomfortable. Little Red noticed it, and after looking about, put his arms round French's neck and climbed on to his knee. "Put Win in your pocket," he whispered. "She got hurt last time Nan and Pet fought." French obeyed, and moving a little farther into the chimney corner, he looked up shyly at Sue, who smiled and came round the high seat to sit beside him. French made room for her on the inside of the bench, and she took Red from him and held the child herself. By this time heavy footsteps could be heard coming across the yard, and the ship waited in a silence only broken by Habakkuk's sniffs and the plaintive mews of Red's little kitten, who was shut in the darkness of French's big pocket. Then the door was kicked open with such a clatter that Habakkuk nearly fell off his seat with nervousness, and Joe stalked into the room. All his usual good humor was gone, and he seemed to Blueneck, at least, to have got quite 6 inches taller. He stood for a moment looking round, his face flushed and his eyes dark with fury. A long, livid weal ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, and he trembled with anger as he stood there breathing heavily. Then, as he caught sight of Blueneck, he gave one whoop of exultation and leapt across the room, landing on top of the unfortunate man, whom he proceeded to punch with all his might. Blueneck was no indifferent fighter himself, and as Joe's first blow landed in his ribs, a dull light of anger kindled in his eyes, and he forced his way to his feet, and then the greatest fight that the Old Ship Tavern had ever witnessed began. They closed in, and Blueneck tried to take advantage of his superior strength by grasping his opponent round the body and swinging him over his head. But Joe was too wiry for that. Seizing his opportunity, he dropped low, and throwing his arms round the sailor's knees, he suddenly crouched so that the man fell over and stretched his body full length on the floor. Before he could again regain his feet, Joe was upon him, and they rolled over and over together, kicking, the Spaniard swearing softly. Joe said nothing, but grit his teeth and fought steadily and swiftly, always making for the man's throat. At last he got there. The Spaniard lay on his back, and Joe, making a desperate dive between his clawing hands, grasped at the hairy throat and held on tightly. Blueneck's mouth opened, and his eyes bulged. Slowly his movements grew less effectual and more convulsive. Joe held on grimly, and without a word, finally, he stood up. "Give him a rum," he said. "I've not done with him yet by a long way." Nobody spoke, but Hal stepped forward with the rum. He had drawn it in readiness, and between them he and Joe raised the half-strangled man to his feet and forced the spirit down his throat. Then, as he grew stronger, Joe took him firmly by the collar and dragged him out of the inn without a word or glance behind him. Sue was on her feet in an instant. "Will he kill him?" she cried. Hal shrugged his shoulders. "No," he said, "I don't reckon so. And if he does, what's a Spaniard anyway?"
Yes,
said Gilbert, holding out his rumkin to be refilled.
what's a Spaniard anyway? Let's have a song.
And as Joe, his wrath hardly one whit abated, dragged the half-suffocated Blueneck down the road to the sea, he heard the jovial strains of Pretty Poll roared out in lively chorus from the ship's kitchen.
Pretty Poll, she loved the sailor, and well she loved he. But he sailed to the mouth of the stream in the south, and was lost in the rolling sea. Lost in the rolling sea.
"Aha!" said Joe between his teeth, as he shook his unfortunate captive by the collar. "And that's what you're going to be, my lad, lost in the rolling sea." Blueneck opened his mouth to expostulate, but Joe swung him round like a meal sack, and tightened his neckerchief so that it was all he could do to breathe, and they hurried on. Joe strode over the ground at a tremendous pace, dragging the Spaniard after him. And not one other word did he speak till they came to the waterside, where Joe's little rowboat, the Amy, flopped and seesawed on the rising tide. Still keeping one hand on Blue Neck's collar, Joe stopped, caught at the riding line, and pulled it in. "Get in," he commanded. Blue Neck obeyed as meekly as a lamb, and Joe stepped in after him and pushed off. He rowed steadily for some seconds, and as the water was very calm, made good progress. About 25 yards from the shore, he pulled in the oars and sat looking at the other man a full minute. Then he spoke sharply. "Change places and row a bit," he said. Blue Neck shrugged his shoulders and did not move. Joe's eyes began to sparkle, and a dull flash suffused his neck and face. "Do as I say," he said quietly. The fresh air and the rum had revived Blue Neck, and he began to feel angry again. Still he did not move. Joe seized an oar. Holding it in both hands, he wielded it above his head. It was a clumsy weapon, however, and the boat rocked dangerously. Instinctively Blue Neck drew back, and before he knew what he was doing, raised himself to a sitting position on the gunwale. This was Joe's opportunity, and he grasped it. Lowering the oar as swiftly as possible, he hove it sharply into the Spaniard's stomach, who immediately doubled up and fell backward into the water. Joe crawled along the boat and looked over the side. Blue Neck came up a little to the left and seized hold of the side. Joe pushed him off, and he sank again and tried to strike out for the shore, but his wind was gone, and he floundered, gasping. Joe looked at him critically. "You won't come near my wife no more," he observed, as he threw the helpless man a line. "Oh, no, you can't come in my boat, dripping as ye are," he said cheerily, as the other, wild-eyed and half-drowned, clawed at the boat. "You hang on that there line, and I'll tow ye in," Joe continued, and, suiting the action to the word, picked up both oars and struck out. When at last the keel grated on the soft shingle, Joe got out, and after first dropping his anchor, looked round for Blue Neck. The man lay still in the water, both hands tightly grasping the line, the ripple of the waves tossing him to and fro. Joe dragged him in, threw him down on a bank of dry seaweed, and stood looking at him for a minute or two. "Ah, I wonder if he be dead now," he said to himself, and he bent down to lift the sailor's eyelids. He tore open the wet remains of Blue Neck's best surcoat and put his hand in the left side. Then he stood up and shrugged his shoulders. "Ah, well," he said, addressing the unconscious body, "seeing that you ain't dead, you may as well live. But you don't come round my house in a hurry again, or there won't be any not quite dead about it. See?" Blue Neck opened his eyes for a second, and then fell back again into unconsciousness. Joe looked round him, heaved a sigh of relief, and, as he strolled off up to the ship, his face assumed once more its wonted good humor. His heavy, sandy lashes fell half over his eyes as usual, and, thrusting his thumbs in his belt, he whistled as clearly, happily, and tunefully as a linnet in May. End of Chapter 10. Recording by John Payton of Omaha, Nebraska. chowdownwright.blogspot.com